Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming this evening and welcome to Plant Sciences. So this talk tonight is hosted by the Cambridge Global Food Security Initiative and also supported by EIT Food as part of the annual Food Agenda project. So I've put some hashtags up there. If anyone's tweeting tonight, please do include those hashtags. And we'd love to see your photos and comments about the event tonight. And just before we start, I have to tell you that there are fire doors on both sides of the lecture theatre. So if the alarm goes off, please go out of either of those and back out to the front lawn. So I think that's it. Oh, there's feedback cards on all around. So if you'd like to leave feedback for us afterwards, please just fill those in and leave them with one of us before you go. Okay. I'll hand over to Professor Howard Griffiths to introduce our speakers for this evening.
Okay, well, welcome one and all. As you've heard, thank you, Jackie. And I'd like to give a big thanks to Jackie for helping to organise and coordinate this and with her other assistants. It's great to see so many of you here. We're starting around about 5 minutes past, which is like traditional if you do a lecture. You normally start 5 past the allotted hour. You've also got the wonderful experience of sitting in the Plant Sciences Lecture Theatre on what are rather uncomfortable pews. So we'll understand if you start shuffling after an hour or so, because that's usually what the students start doing. So, without further ado, the issue we have facing us in terms of being a confused consumer is that we are constantly being bombarded with issues which relate to whether we should be eating less food, whether we should be eating slightly different types of food, whether we should be eating less salt, less sugar, and all of these things are associated with a big agenda, a big global agenda of food poverty, which hits very differently in the developed world as opposed to the developing world. And I hope that our distinguished team of speakers this evening will give us some insight into those issues in their initial introductory statements. So the plan is for the evening that, I should call them up to take their seats at the table. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome Professor Dame Theresa Marteau, who has come in off her sickbed to come and be with us. Didn't want to let you guys down. So really fantastic, Theresa. Thank you for coming in. Her research focuses on development and evaluation of interventions to change behaviour. So that's what we want to hear about. How are you going to convince us to change our behaviour, Theresa? David Good, are you going to come and take your seats? I think.
We want to see what we're all saying.
Oh, right, okay. So who's... Okay, all right, then. Well, you'll have to stand up when I introduce you, and then okay. So David Good...
Prime exhibit.
There we go. Working on novel technologies and social interventions, and finally Jag Shry, who is at the... I should say David's in the Department of Psychology. Jag is in the Institute for Manufacturing here in Cambridge, but works on supply chain analysis, and is also co-chair of the Food Security IRC. So welcome to all three. So I think, Theresa, you are kicking off, as it were, in the nicest possible way. I will attempt to chair proceedings, so I hope that there isn't too much of a Twitter storm in the manner of the question time session that will follow these brief presentations, but I look forward to your interactions at that point. Theresa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard, and thank you all for coming out. This is a pretty good attendance for a sold-out performance. Usually about 30% don't attend for anything that's sold out, so we're looking pretty good. What I want to talk about is redesigning environments as an antidote to the confusion that many of us might feel, particularly when we go shopping. And Howard laid out a very broad agenda looking at high, middle and low income countries and thinking about over as well as under consumption of food. So I'm going to be focusing very much on high income countries and over consumption of food. So what do we buy? We buy lots of things, but one of the things in this country we specialise in, and in a survey of 19 European countries, we buy an awful lot of ultra-processed foods. So the majority of food that goes into the houses in the UK is ultra-processed. So you can see that it's over 50, slightly over 50%, with Germany and Ireland being right up there, compared with Portugal, where the rates are much lower. Ultra-processed foods is a definition that's often challenged, but think of it as the food that is generally produced in factories involving ingredients that your grandmother wouldn't recognise and owes very little to the plant or animal kingdoms. And prime examples shown here on the right-hand side. What are the consequences of this? Well, one of the consequences is obesity, and what you can see on the left-hand side is a table of obesity for OECD countries, and you'll see that the UK very much punches above its weight, as it were, in terms of obesity. And on the right-hand side, you can see that we're still trying to compete with many states in the US. But nonetheless, we have a major problem in this country from obesity, mainly due to overconsumption, particularly of some of those ultra-processed foods. Now, I would imagine that this is not news to anybody in this room. So why doesn't that information change our behaviour? Well, information does sometimes change our behaviour, and that's illustrated in these two pictures here. So we are exquisitely sensitive to information about existential threats, i.e. the threat that is incompatible with life, and in particular living towards the end of the day. But for the longer term threats, which is what we're talking about when we're thinking about obesity and the consequences of obesity and overconsumption of foods such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and some cancers, that tends to be in the longer term, and it's probabilistic. It's not a straightforward, perfect relationship between the two. So the perception of threat is not enough for people to change their behaviour. And even when it is, environments, and this is the key point of my presentation, have a very strong influence on our behaviour, much stronger than we want to believe. So the focus then, thinking about the food that we buy and bring into our homes and therefore are more likely to eat, is very much influenced by the design of supermarkets. And what I want to do is to say a little bit about what we know about how supermarkets are designed in such a way that nudge us towards buying unhealthier foods. And I want to touch on some of the pretty limited evidence we have about how the availability, the kinds of foods that are available in the supermarkets that we now have, the size of the foods that are available, as well as the types of labels on those foods, as well as where in store they are, and how those can influence what we end up putting in our trolleys, therefore taking home, and once they're home, we're more likely to consume them. So looking first of all at availability, in fact there have been very few studies that have looked at what happens if you increase or decrease the proportion of healthier and less healthier foods in supermarkets. And we can come on at the end to talk about why there is so little evidence. But the evidence we do have mainly comes from experimental studies looking at vending machines, where it's much easier to do those experiments, and cafeterias. And that evidence suggests that where you increase the proportion of healthier food, then people are more likely to select the healthier food. I'm just going to give one example, which comes from a study that we've conducted in 6 different worksite cafeterias. This is a bit busy, so I'm just going to ask you to concentrate on the data combined from 6 different worksite cafeterias. And what this is looking at is when we increase the proportion of healthier food, which we defined as lower calories, for main meals, snacks, sandwiches and cold drinks. So what that would mean is if there were 6 main meals that were offered, then if we would, for a lunchtime, at 500 calories each, and we reduce the calories in 2 of those 5 to 300 calories, we would have increased the proportion of healthier foods. And we then looked at all the calories that were purchased in the worksite cafeteria once those changes had been made. So once the changes have been made, you can see there's a decrease in calories that people using the worksites purchased. You'll also notice that it varied, the size of the effect varied across the different worksites. Nonetheless, it's proving or revealing a principle that if you make healthy food available, then people do seem to go for it. Size, what we know is that in a supermarket there are many large packs, portions, and also discounts on larger volumes, which make them very attractive. And the evidence that we have, first of all, is that food has got bigger. These are iconic American products that are now increasingly available here. And as you can see, along with the food getting bigger, the people also got bigger. So the question is that correlation or is that causal? And in a very large systematic literature review where we brought together the experimental evidence worldwide, we found 69 experiments that have varied the size of portions, packages or tableware. And what we found was a consistent effect that people will eat more the more stuff in front of them. And that's regardless of how big they are or their gender. So we translated that because the important thing is how much of an effect is there. And this is a heroic assumption, but nonetheless, if you bear with it, if for all occasions on which someone confronts food, all the food and all the tableware on every occasion, then is smaller, you could reduce how much a UK adult consumes per day by around 279 calories. Now that would involve all the supermarkets changing what's available, the portion sizes as well as the packaging, and having more proportionate pricing. Labelling. Well, there are very few robust studies. So in store, this is a typical label that you might see on the back of a packet of food. And in another systematic literature review looking at labelling, we found 27 studies that had varied, that had looked at what the impact was of labelling on what people bought or ate. And we found only one study that had looked at this in a supermarket. That's all there is. So it's not possible to comment on that. There's interest now in looking at the evidence from tobacco. Some of you will be familiar with the graphic health warnings on tobacco. There are, again, very few robust studies here, but there are a few suggesting that on particular items, such as sugary drinks, that can have an effect on what people buy. But, and hopefully we'll come to this in discussion, is it acceptable to have those kinds of images on less healthy food? Where there's more evidence is putting calorie labelling on menus, and in our literature review we found 3 studies that have varied this all in the US, in cafeterias or coffee shops, and that showed it reduced the calories that people selected. In 9 worksite cafeterias, we failed to replicate that finding in the UK. In another study, another review, they found that it did reduce calories purchased and it also reduced the calories of the foods that were made available. So it's a pretty murky picture. There's also a growing interest in, I don't know if you can see that, looking at what's called physical activity calorie equivalents on food. So this is showing at the top a cheese pizza with 489 calories. It would take you 5.1 miles to walk that off. A whole apple, 0.8 miles. Whether that does make a difference, not known yet. There are a few robust studies, but people are getting more excited about that than straightforward calorie labelling, so watch this space. So finally, I just want to say a couple of words about place. In one survey, it suggested that 43% of the food on aisle ends in supermarkets is either sugary drinks or sugary foods. And 1% is fruit or vegetables, and the rest must be other stuff. Anyway, a huge proportion of ultra-processed foods. Very few studies on this. One study conducted by my group, which looked at the placement of drinks on aisle ends, and this used data from radio frequency tracking devices that were attached to supermarket trolleys. I think 50,000 of them were used in the analysis, which document where in the store the item that went into the trolley came from. And I just want to draw your attention to fizzy drinks, and what you can see is that when the drink was placed on an aisle end, it was 52% more likely to end up in a trolley than on the occasions when it was off an aisle end. So it looks like this is having a large effect on what goes into your trolley. In till areas, an area that has been very controversial, another group in Cambridge led by Jean Adams has looked at, not in an experimental study, but in a quasi-experimental study, they've been able to look at what happens in the supermarkets that removed sweets, chocolates or crisps from the till ends, and the sales of those items fell in those stores by 17%, and that effect was maintained at a year. So, this is a quick summary of not the image, but what a supermarket redesign for health would look like. Most of the food and drink in it would be healthier. The packs would be smaller, smaller portions shown on them, and there'd be proportionate pricing so that you wouldn't be paying less for more, as it were. Possibly the labelling would have graphic warnings on the less healthy foods. There'd be no unhealthy foods on the aisle ends, and till areas would be free of food and drink. I leave you with the question, how do we achieve that? So I want to thank you for your attention. I also want to acknowledge not only the researchers, some of whose names you've seen as I've gone through, but also the funders who've allowed all this research to take place. So the Wellcome Trust, the MRC and the National Institute for Health Research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Theresa. That was really fascinating insight. Now we're going to hand over to David Good from the Department of Psychology. We'll have a quick change of slides. And thank you also for keeping the time. Hold on to those questions that I hope you're making notes on and thinking about. We'll try to deal with as many of those as possible at the end of the presentations. David.
Fine. Thank you, Howard. As you will know from your own experience, humans are complicated creatures. And the features that Theresa has been talking about are one part of the story of that complexity and a very important part of the story. Knowing what she was going to be talking about, I thought I'd raise some issues for you about the ways in which we operate in the social world, the ways in which that operation has consequences for the way in which we make choices and the way in which we understand what we're doing. And ultimately, it ends up being focused on how we think about our social identity. And now I need to find out how to make this work. So I'll probably take somebody's eye out. My apologies. No, not that one. That one. This is me last weekend. Typical shopping experience, you move into the supermarket and you suddenly feel like you've had a sort of frontal lobotomy. You can't make a choice about anything. If you look at that particular picture, give it perhaps a more realistic representation, it's a classic thing we always face. We go into a supermarket and we've got endless choice facing us. Interestingly, some supermarkets are now finding that giving us this amazing amount of choice is actually a big problem for them. You probably know of the low-priced supermarkets like Aldi and Lidl. Well, they do actually make quite a good pitch from the point of view of their pricing, but also they don't give consumers so much choice. The typical Waitrose will carry 4 times the number of stock options that a typical Aldi will offer you. So what do we do when we actually get faced with this choice? Well, some of us stand there for hours and we actually make a choice and we get to a point where we understand what we want. Some of us do like to act like the rational, utility-maximising soul that the economists love, but most of us look for some quick out, some way of actually understanding what we might buy. And what do we classically do? Well, if you look at the ways in which social organisation has an impact on the choices we make, we tend to go for the style leaders, the gurus that we follow, the people we think who might have made a good choice in some or another. In other words, we look forward to seeing somebody who might advise us. Now, you probably recognise both these people. This one on the... Have I got the right thing? No? Oh, a bit in the middle. Oh, technology is so tricky. The fake Dr. Gillian McKeith, who nevertheless has made a fortune out of selling health foods to people, and lots of people follow what she says. Been very successful. By contrast, Nigella Lawson offers a view about how you eat for enjoyment, how you might actually benefit from it because you like it. Again, people turn to people that they think are actually the guide for what they would want to do. So we're very driven in some respects by what you might call style gurus. They stand out in our community, and in some respects there's a degree of identification with them, a recognition that they are perhaps like us. Here's the second thing I want to focus on. You've probably seen this advert. 2 guys providing advice on the radio, a radio program for phone-in questions from people just like them. Of course, they're advertising Fosters. The advertising industry is very good at understanding how a lot of these processes work. And who would be a typical Foster's drinker? Well, it'd be somebody like these guys. Sitting there, and I think this was the particular session when they were providing advice to a guy called Dwayne, who was actually talking about the different kinds of swimming trunks he might wear. So it picks up on a whole series of motifs that gives an identification with the person looking at it. And of course, when you get those patterns of social identification, it's a very important issue in how we think about the choices we make and what looks attractive to us, is that when you have a sense of fraternity, a sense of conviviality, a sense of collegiality with the people that are presenting the materials to you, if those materials, like for example Foster's beer, get to be part of the identity, we actually feel good. When we're with people we like, we enjoy that. There is actually a very important affective component to this. And it shows up in all sorts of ways, because what we choose to eat, what we choose to drink, in fact reflects how we view some aspects of our identity. It operates across a whole range of different activities. So, for example, here's one that's even made it onto an LP cover. Not an LP anymore, a CD cover, and that probably even dates me, as you can tell. The key thing is, with particular communities, particular groups, it's not just the way you dress, and obviously if you're a rap star, the way you dress is a key part of it, but all sorts of other things go with it. In various ways, your eating choices reflect the ways in which you identify yourself in the world and who you identify with. And importantly, if you make choices outside that remit, that feels difficult, that can be awkward. Let me take you off to something different. Next thing I want to raise for you. This is a rather ancient study, and indeed it's got a misprint in it, so I seem to have ended up with eating Offal there. But Offal, heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, brain, all those bits that people often find themselves a bit squeamish about. Now, during the Second World War, the US government realised that a huge amount of protein was going to waste because housewives would not serve to their family heart, lung, liver, intestine, tripe, brain, and the like. So they thought, how do we get the housewives of America to eat more offal, serve it more often to their family? Well, the first thought was, we'll get along a 5-star general, and he will tell the housewives of America how important it is that they eat and they serve offal to their family, and that means we have more protein to go to the troops and to our allies. So 5-star general comes along, and he does the required thing and tells the housewives what they wanted to do, and he has a major impact on their judgments. They didn't take much notice of him at all. 3% changed their habits. But Levine, the man responsible for this study, recognised that social organisation and social identity mattered greatly for the choices that people make. He recognised that an individual has all their views about who they are and who they identify with, as I've got there on the slide. So he thought, let's set up a discussion group between the women involved. Let's get them talking about why they would or why they wouldn't, what it means to them, how it would look if they were seen in the eyes of others to be actually presenting to their family this kind of foodstuff. In other words, trying to get them to take responsibility for the decision and it becoming part of their identity. Hey presto, you got a major effect. About a third of them started to take into the household and serve to their families offal. Okay, it's an old study. It's actually been replicated in a variety of ways. And the processes which underpinned it, as with the first cases I was looking at, the processes are well documented and well supported by a whole variety of evidence. Now here's a nice little spring picture. The next thing I wanted to draw to your attention. Happy little ducklings. Well, one of the lines of the kind of theorising I'm talking about, or basing what I'm talking about on, is the idea that you understand who you are by understanding who's like you. It's the birds of a feather flocking together idea. And you understand who you are because of the similarities between you. In various ways you might think, well, that's good, and you also think that, of course, you understand who you are by looking at the group you're in and how that's different to other groups. So ducklings are not goslings, and they're not baby chicks and so forth. So you get all those kind of things going on. The interesting thing is that if you look at the ways in which we identify with people in our group, one of the things that stands out is that in various ways eating habits can become contagious. They become part of the story of what we do. And following what Theresa was saying, you can see the ways in which things like obesity can spread through a group. Many studies have looked at this, but the rather famous one was based on the Framingham Heart study. This is a large cohort of some 12,000 people studied in Massachusetts between 1971 and 2003. Huge amount of data on various parameters about physical health and indeed psychological health. It's called the Framingham Heart Study. Now with this data set, one of the things they were able to track was what would happen if two people came to know each other within this wider set of people. And you'd have instances where one person was not obese, their BMI was under 25, becoming connected to somebody whose BMI was over 25. And you can find all sorts of controls for understanding the statistical effect here. And one of the things they found was that if you started developing friendships with people who had a high BMI, your BMI went up. So if we think about the things that Theresa was just saying about the ways in which you can make the availability of food, you can make the plates smaller or larger, and all those, shall we say, circumstantial factors in the physical world, likewise in the social world. So we see a clear and very important causal relationship in operation there. How do we think about all this? Well, there is one theory in the literature which sounds rather grand when you call it a theory. It's called the theory of planned behaviour. But it's a very simple idea at root. There is a tendency to think that the attitudes we have towards doing something are simply the driver of what we do. I'm in favour of this, But as Theresa was saying, you can have people have all the information, actually know the story very well, and they fail to make the right choice. So their attitudes, their understanding, this bit in red in the middle here, might be all the right thing. They might be the people who've actually followed the public health information programs. But what you find is that these two other factors massively come into play to affect whether or not the behavioural outcome is what you would predict from what they know and what their attitudes are. You often find in people who have health problems through overeating, overweight, their attitudes are all in the right direction. They want to do the right thing, but they don't. And why don't they? Well, a large part of it is this section up here. The beliefs associated with the group that you see yourself part of, how you identify within this particular network, this particular social grouping, and as part of that, the extent to which you believe you can exercise control. Because your behaviour in the world, what you actually do, feeds back into how you understand yourself and how you react and operate with respect to your peers, those who are in your group, those who are not in your group. How you see yourself identified and how you feel about it is a very important part of the decisions you make, what you choose to do. So these sorts of things come in very strongly to complement what Theresa was talking about. What that leads to really in the end, if you think about that set of things, these are effectively the identity that we have. In various ways you can say we are what we eat. These things go on inside us. They drive actually how we think about our social world, the choices we make, and how we pick up on the things that Theresa was saying. These are complementary. It's a multifactorial story. And importantly, how we feel about these things becomes an important issue. So to paraphrase an old line, we are what we eat, but not simply in these terms, but also in those terms. And I hope I haven't just ruined your dinner. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Oops, there we go. So thank you very much. We've heard from Theresa about a nudge. We've heard from David about behavioural norms. So now I'm pleased to welcome Jane Shrine, who's perhaps going to give us some insight more into the supply side. Cheers.
Thank you, Howard. And just wanted to check how many of you are regular online shoppers at Amazon or your regular shop? Good. Well, this will have some interest for you, I'm sure. That seems quite a lot of us. So this is the question I really want to pose was, how does e-commerce retail provide consumers a sustainable supply chain model? So yes, we're getting convenience, but is it a sustainable activity? A little bit of work we've been doing at our Centre for International Manufacturing. The rapid growth of e-commerce we've been looking at over the last 5-6 years. And early on in our research, maybe about 8-10 years ago, it was going to be 20-30%. I was writing that in my academic papers. I wasn't quite sure if I believed it. It's gone well past that. So maybe 30% of our shopping, be it wholesale or retail, could be, depending on the place we live, through that e-commerce online shop. In the UK, it's around 14%, and in the US, in some states, upwards of 20%. Now, this chart on my right is just the number of different products one manufacturer sends to one retailer. It's just over 1,300. And there's a huge amount of data as to how many shoppers buy a particular product in a particular location. And we start to get information about who these shoppers are. How old are they? How often do they shop? And we picked 6 of those products, we call them stock keeping units, SKUs, and started mapping them, and that's the chart on my left. And we start to look at how frequently they shop by geographic location. And we have an enormous amount of data now as to who is shopping, when and what. And going back to the first talk, is it the physical aisle anymore? And are the nudges now a virtual nudge, an online nudge, rather than the end of aisle? So we can learn a lot of lessons from the first conversation on this topic this afternoon. Now, yes, we get convenience, yes, we get speed. I live a little bit south of Cambridge, towards the Hearts-London border. I'm offered 2-hour delivery. And I'm offered that from a whole series of retailers. And if we move into the food context, we've seen Amazon Fresh, Grocery, Deliveroo, and Ocado. And I won't play this YouTube video, but something you can pick up online. This is a typical Ocado type warehouse. Thousands of robots, bots as we call them. This is one of them here, in the series of bots, feeding stations, running at 4 meters per second without human intervention. And we're currently involved in some of this design work as to how these operations are designed and scaled up from a robot manufacturing activity. And in London, your Tesco's will have more than 10 of these, M&S and all the other key retailers, just so that we can get shipments within that 2-hour window on demand. Now, traditional retailers, those that haven't been born through that electronic format, have had to follow suit, because this is where the growth is. I think all of you are responsible because of your online shopping. So in addition to the in-store shop, click and collect, local pickup points, home delivery, the amount of innovation in here is staggering. Now, the question is this sustainable? I get an Amazon delivery, I think once or twice a day. I blame my 3 daughters for that. But it's particularly interesting of how reliant we have become on that supply model. But are we doing the planet any favours? Now, last mile logistics is not a new thing. It used to exist in the days of Pony Express. If you want to read the ad, it's quite interesting. So young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, willing to risk death. Orphans preferred. So, as academics, we're supposed to be doing the new stuff. So that's what we're doing. In the 21st century, last mile configurations look a little bit like this. What you have in the centre of the chart is that dark store that I talked about. This is our online shop and that rapid delivery. And the growth in this area is very, very significant indeed. So what does this mean in terms of transport, carbon, and whole sustainability? So we've been looking at some of this in our research on what's the cost per journey, right up here, versus what's the market penetration in a particular urban environment. So as the market gets more and more developed, the costs come down, and you start to develop those cost curves. The higher the population density, the more economic it becomes. And some of you may, I don't know if any of you are from the southwest of England, but e-commerce options are switched off in the winter because the population drops. None of that summer holiday commuters are over there. It's just not economic to deliver the product to the home. So it's switched on and switched off depending on how the urban population fluctuates. I live in a particularly highly urbanised environment and I get a lot of choice. So what we've been trying to do is trying to look at, indeed, how does market penetration impact that delivery run? And it seems to be about 19 drops on a milk round, as we call it, is the economics to make a case for a delivery. But interesting, even in that scenario, the cost of that last mile, as we call it, it's often more than a last mile, maybe a couple of miles, is more than the manufacturing cost of the product and its primary shipment. So there's a lot of cost involved, but also quite a significant amount of carbon consumed in that delivery. So we try and raise the sustainability. And in one of our projects that we've just commenced this year, this has now become not just a cost curve, but a resource curve. Can we look at costs as well as the resources as we move down the e-commerce pathway? Too many words on this slide, so I'll skip quite quickly across sort of 3 or 4 streams. I'm doing some work with the World Economic Forum on digitalization and how it might impact different manufacturing supply chains. And from a consumer supply chain perspective, what digitalization does, it allows us to now look at individual consumer demands. So it's not what should your store hold, but it's what should be supplied to a specific home. E-commerce we've talked about, the modelling tools on how we would design that supply chain I've just shared, but also these new urban contexts. How do digital platforms start to engage the consumer in ways not previously understood, but also how can we introduce sustainability into that conversation? How might we introduce improved origin tracking so I know where my product has come from? And how might we reduce waste? Can we get the consumers engaged in some of these topics? Now, for this slide, you need to assume I'm Beth. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but I can have my own setup profile. Maybe I'm Beth on the weekends, I don't know. I can set a profile. I can search or scan particular foods. I can start to look at filters. You know, how much sugar am I prepared to take? What are my key ingredients and nutritional information? And this is a very personalised conversation. And this is an offering by Food Maestro, and there's many like it. We've just developed an app very similar to this for medicine delivery, trying to look at medicine interactions in healthcare. So, engaging the consumer and personalisation is a reason to perhaps hope that we can start to influence some of their behaviours. So, do these digital platforms in fact provide these new opportunities to connect consumers with perhaps their local retailers and farmers, offering that personalisation? Can we engage consumers for a more informed shopping basket? And indeed, inventory is a very common word in my field around supply chain. But if we know we've got surplus inventory moving close to a sell-by date, can we engage the consumer base to perhaps push certain products and avoid waste? So it's a good opportunity to introduce a new grant activity, the EIT Food. It's a European programme of work. It's a large grant fund of 340 million, a number of partners, of which Cambridge is a really active player. And it starts to look at putting Europe at the centre of the global revolution in food innovation. I haven't picked the European theme for any particular reason today, but I know there's an important vote going on in Parliament. But what are the aims here? Overcome low consumer trust. So do we trust these digital platforms? Can we create consumer valued food for healthy nutrition? Can we create that consumer-centric connected supply chain? And start to introduce these concepts around sustainability. Now, as consumers, are we able to unpick these complexities and unintended consequences of modern retail? Now, I'm finding this topic very confusing. So what does and that's my day job. So what does the average consumer take on board? And one of the topics that Howard was trying to entrap me on earlier this year was around, are we sourcing our products from sustainable regions? Is the water that is consumed during the production process, and as well as the water contained in the product, being shipped around the world? And are we sourcing from low-cost locations where perhaps they have the least surplus resources to actually export? And this particular program, Global Challenge Research Fund and the Tigris Project, aims to do specifically that. And one of the aspects of that work package that we're leading at our Centre for International Manufacturing seeks to look at, in a particular region in India, what is the consumption pattern currently, and how might it change if we change the production technology and how a product is put together, the particular location in which that product is manufactured, to make it a more sustainable conversation. And that requires us to look at a number of things: the production technology in which a manufactured product is produced, what's the ideal supply chain or footprint globally, and how do we serve particular markets. Now, if you hook that back into my previous conversation of the on-demand, spoiled consumer jag trying to pull product on a 2-hour basis, and these very long international supply chains, there's a real conversation to be had on the sustainability of that aspect. So the research aims to look at that design of the network, how best do we use resources and water in particular, and how do we manage the water resources as part of a stewardship conversation. Now, why am I focusing on waste? Just a few slides here on significant waste in the food supply chain. So if you're not aware of it, these are all double-digit numbers in terms of the waste in a particular product supply chain. So anything between 20 and 45%. And what we've been trying to look at is the waste in the agri process, the production of the initial crop. Is it in the manufacturing process, or finally, is it in the household? And can we attack these specifically based on either production technology or consumer behaviour? Now let's come back onto these digital platforms. If it's too complicated and the platform's going to sort it out for us, do we trust those nudge algorithms of big retail to click us out of this complex jungle? Coming back to the theme of the talk. So, there's 2 projects I highlight here in part of that EIT food program: GLAD, which is Green Last Mile Delivery, and Organic Supply Chain. And here we're looking at a number of aspects, but I'll just highlight a couple. Exploring the use of nudge techniques to ensure sustainable options are communicated to consumers. And that's a very interesting aspect and link into the previous talks we've just heard of. The second is using predictive analytics. I think you're all familiar with, you bought a product and suddenly you get suggested about a product others have bought. Can we anticipate or indeed influence consumption and reduce waste through these smart inventory management strategies? So that's a specific piece of work that we're doing in the GLAD project. Do we build consolidation centres so it's not individual consumers getting deliveries to the home, but a network of consumers in a particular urban context that are supplied collectively? And can we share these digital platforms so it's not a single multinational or retailer that's driving that change? So those are a couple of projects I'm just drawing you onto. So just to wrap up, as I guess we're tight on time, I posed a number of questions in these few slides. The first one about the growth of e-commerce and is it sustainable? Well, we need to integrate a sustainable dimension and engage the key stakeholders. For me, they're the big retailers and the multinational manufacturers, but importantly, it's the consumer who may be the real change agent here. Is last mile e-commerce a sustainable option in terms of use of resources? I think it could be, based on consolidation models, so many users using a common supply channel, and smarter use of input resources and inventory. So it's a very much informed purchase. The key question that some of our behavioural team guys are working on is, are indeed the consumers engaged? And do digital platforms provide a new opportunity to engage that consumer? So that's a key aspect of our research projects, and be very keen to share that as we go through and progress over the next few years in that activity. And one of the areas which we're focusing on is really the development of digital platforms. We've done some work in areas of transport such as Uber and its move into Uber Eats, using an existing network to move into a food sector. We're trying to look at how consumer involvement, so your association is with the digital platform rather than a product, perhaps. And how do you ensure there's appropriate governance? Because there's a lot of data now. I'll go back as being Beth for a few seconds. They know what I'm buying, when I'm buying it, and who do we want to know, who should have access to that data, and what are we comfortable with. So that's my few minutes on this topic. I'd like to acknowledge some fellow researchers in the team that are working with me on this, and the 3 specific grants that are supporting the work. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon our 3 speakers to take their seats in this in the firing line, as it were, and we'll attempt to moderate the discussion. And there's going to be a roving microphone, perhaps which we'll try and get to. The acoustics aren't brilliant in here, and we'll share the microphone when necessary. If you haven't got the microphone but you've got a good, you can project well, do just shout out. So I'm looking for contributions. I'm going to start right at the back. There's a can you?
Hi, Ben Platings from Sugarwise. Question for Theresa. Yeah, wonderful, very interesting, amazing presentation. Thank you so much for that, all 3 of you actually. Availability, shock horror. If more healthy food is available, consumers are more likely to buy more of it. Why do you think that's not being more addressed on the political, we're talking about taxation and we're talking about all of these other things. Why do you think that we're not talking about making more healthy food available, maybe more like-for-like swaps, lower tax on healthier food and drink, that type of thing?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for your question. I spoke very in generalities and not very specifically. So what I was really focused on, the evidence comes from not adding more healthy options, but reducing the unhealthy and increasing the healthy. So it's about shifting the proportion. And a lot of our research is what is sometimes called the art of bleeding obvious. And I think that's what you're pointing out, and I don't disagree with that. But in order to inform policy, one needs evidence, and that which seems obvious isn't always the case. And what we're often doing is trying to estimate, well, how much of a difference might that make? For instance, it could well be that we provide a lot of healthier foods, and people won't select them and they'll go elsewhere. So the evidence at the moment does not seem to suggest that. So your other points were, why isn't anybody doing this?
Well, I guess my point was that most of the policy discussion is around taxation of the unhealthy options, and less of the policy discussion is around incentivising more healthy options being available. And I was wondering, what
yes. So I think you're right about that, but the taxation, particularly on sugar in drinks, is aimed towards having a healthier range that's available. In terms of the interventions that I mentioned, there's a consultation that is open at the moment from the current government, which is on place. So it's called Marteau, and it's a public consultation, wanting views from people on regulating where in store less healthy foods are being promoted, as well as looking at price promotions to reduce the price promotions whereby people are being offered 2-for-1 on less healthy products. So it's part of the Childhood Obesity Plan, Chapter 2, as it's called. So government is consulting on this at the moment, so it's not just taxation.
Okay, can we move? I'd like to get as many people in as possible. We've had a very nice run on that.
Just Google.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the front row being quite persistent. Sorry.
Hi, thank you very much for the it was a very interesting presentation, all three. Basically, I wanted to ask my question, which is comes from David Wood's presentation, which basically said, well, discussion groups worked in terms of getting people to eat Offal. I understand it also works in getting people to eat if they're diabetic and Indian, because they've done the same kind of thing. And the groups work better haranguing people about their diet. But my other question is, in who life defines who is defined by who likes you, then my question is, well, do you need to see the discussion groups? Basically, you need to bring us in there who have got the right answers, how people want to be, because it could go one way, these discussion groups. If the whole lot of these people in that discussion group, they might actually get obese. And that's not what we would hope.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take that. David.
Well, if I can come in there, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not just the mere fact of a discussion group, there's a question of identity between people and how the activity is set up. Now, of course, one discussion group we're probably all familiar with is Alcoholics Anonymous. How those activities are run is very important from the point of view of developing choices and practices that you move people away from alcoholism. And one of the things that none of us have spoken about is that the things that Theresa was talking about, that I was talking about in terms of individual persons, and the way that Jack was talking about, if you like, the broader circumstance of the operation of the market and how that drives various things. None of us are talking about the ways in which some of the fundamentals of how your physiology leads you to feel can drive you to make some of these choices. So if you can do it in the case of alcoholism, where alcohol withdrawal symptoms are very serious, it produces real craving, you can make it work. But as you suggest, you need to be careful on how you set it up and how you structure and organise it.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to the top.
Good point.
Well, I have a question for Dr. Jacqueline. You mentioned about food waste and high percentage of dairy grains being wasted. How do you think e-commerce will affect this waste, and does it have any potential to reduce it?
So, in terms of waste, there's a number of ways. We sort of compartmentalise it into three areas. One, dairy waste, the other one is manufacturing waste, and the third one is household. I think the solutions in the three areas become very, very different. I think what I was alluding to was how the revolution in data allows us to match supply and demand. So if I just take two of those areas around the sort of industrial supply chain and the household, is at the moment if there's surplus stock or inventory in a retailer, we just wait for that to hit its sell-by date and then it's consumed. There's a bit of price change, of course, that takes place. But digital platforms allow us to influence that in many different ways. So being very proactive about targeting particular consumers with particular inventory. If I go back into the banking part of the supply chain, the circular economy conversation that takes place is really about taking waste streams and utilising them for useful products. So indeed, in the Time Waste project, we're in India and Punjab in a few weeks, and we're looking at specific waste streams, which one may be familiar with. In Delhi, in around November to January time, there's a huge smog problem, and that's farmers burning off waste products. And we actually have major organisations, in fact, like I mentioned IKEA in this instance, we're actually using that so-called waste into value-added products. So right away through the supply chain, there are opportunities. But it's about getting awareness of
the gentleman over here.
Last time I was in this video, I went to a cafe, and there was no label on site. Everyone seemed to be really thin. They seemed to be eating sugary snacks, lovely, delicious ice cream, lovely coffee, but everyone was really thin. The last time I was in America, in McDonald's, favourite place of mine, everyone was beautifully labelled. It was really clear how many calories there were, but the audience, or the people eating, weren't quite so thin as they were. So I was wondering whether the panel had any thoughts as to why the more labels there are, the fatter people seem to be eating.
I didn't know where you were sampling, whether it was the University of Cambridge, was it MIT?
I was outside Barnes, I was in Seattle, so it was
okay.
So it was typical.
So I think one needs to be very careful in inferring causality from correlation. It's been observed that in the US never has so much low-fat food being sold to so many people who've just got bigger and bigger. So the evidence, I think the one thing to know about obesity is that there is no one solution. I think that's the first thing. And I talked about, mixed, murky, difficult to find effects from many of these interventions, and often one's talking about effects where they are there of, tiny, sort of 1 or 2%, which can be easily washed out with other effects that are happening in the same environment. And it's difficult enough running one experiment in a lab or in a field setting. So I showed experiments that are conducted in 6 cafeterias, and you can see you've got mixed effects. And if we did a study in just one of those, we could easily draw the conclusion this is having no effect. What we've yet to do is to be able to multiply up this kind of behavioural science such that we can look not just at the effect of calorie labelling, but calorie labelling when combined with particular kinds of food in particular kinds of settings. So I'd say that it's an embryonic field, and I think your observations speak well to how humble we have to know, how humble we have to be about what we know.
I have to say, the observations are consistent with the data that you show, which show that Italy has a very low obesity relative to it. So again, that ties in, but it's not sure how we're going to tackle it. Right?
Well, can I just add a couple of things there? I mean, for all these public policy issues, we are trying to change behaviour. You have to see it as a long game. This is not something you can win quickly. If one thinks back to the ways in which we changed the mentality in this country about drink driving, that was a long game. The other thing that none of us have spoken about, I think it is some interesting work that's currently going on, is, and some of it was led at the Centre for Metabolic Research here by our colleague Theresa, is the ways in which the microbiome in the gut, in fact, has kind of very interesting consequences for effectively brain processes. So if we look at the ways in which your gut, which in some respects you might think of as a second brain, operates and is affected, the endocrine system is affected by the way in which that operates, that in turn has effects on your appetite. So if you then look at that additional complexity in the story, I mean, Sadaf's point is that if you look at us, we grew up, we evolved in an environment where you had to make the most of the calories that were around you. Bless you. We are surrounded by calories all the time. So in fact, the default outcome ought to be that you get very large. I remember being at a meeting with her, and she said the real puzzle in all of this is not that some people are obese, it's that people like you aren't. She said it a bit more graphically than that, but I'll leave that for you today.
I think there's another aspect to the question earlier, and perhaps yours around choice. And going back to the sort of digital superstore, the options for offering choice really changed dramatically. I've seen some representatives of large manufacturers in the room. Typically in a region, you might offer thing I would say is typically our shop has moved from once a week to 2 to 3 times a week. And again, choice plays a role in that. So you might find the online shop allows you to get those niche products that not many people buy. And then the other journeys become for some of the more ready purchases. So I think availability is a key part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we've got another question up the back there.
Thank you for the great talk. So my question is for Dr. Martin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, sorry. So you mentioned the study about the labeling being different results in the US, UK, and in the country. And I was wondering if that was somehow embedded in the fact that consumers themselves have a low threshold of calorie intake in different countries. For example, in UK, if the baseline is lower, then the effect itself will not be as visible as in the US, where you have much higher calorie intake when they go to cafeteria. And I was a follow-up, just wondering if you had any thoughts about moral hazard when you have this calorie labeling, whether if they are intake, the calorie intake is reduced in the cafeteria, do they then go back to some other place and have more?
Thanks. Great questions. In terms of trying to explain why in the 3 studies we found with our systematic literature review, all from the US, that showed the effect of calorie labeling in reducing the calories that were selected in coffee shops or restaurants, but we failed to find that in 9 outside cafeterias. In the 3 studies, if I'm correct in remembering, in the US, 2 were actually on university campuses, and the other was a health insurance company. So I'm not sure that there would be much difference in calorie intake in individuals. What I do know is that in our 9 cafeterias, we had much larger sample size. So I'm more confident in our findings than the ones from the US. So I think it's more about robustness, but I did flag up the country, so that's a very good question. You also asked the question about moral hazard or self-licensing effects. So I don't know if people are familiar with that. So that we've documented this in one lab study for low alcohol beers and wine. So if you see that something is low fat or low alcohol, you think, oh, great, goody, I can have more of that. And the question then becomes, do you have so much that actually you end up consuming even more than if you had, the high strength or the high calorie version? So it's been a favourite of many psychologists to follow that line. We looked at that specifically in our systematic literature review, and we couldn't find evidence for that. So it looks like that isn't explaining it. What we're really seeing is an absence or a very small effect. For the one lab study with low alcohol labeling, we did find that kind of self-licensing, no pun intended. But I think that nonetheless, one could argue that information about calories, people have a right to that, and there is a small amount of evidence that it can change the behaviour of the retailers and in turn the manufacturers, who are quite keen not to have too many traffic light reds in their sandwich range or on their drink range. So it may well be that it affects the supply chain, which in turn changes the availability, which in turn can change what we end up consuming.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We have one from you. Anybody else would like to have a... Yeah, there's somebody in the middle there. While we get a microphone to you, we'll make it a little time. Can I just ask generally, while we get the microphone to you, so where we're going? Who? Oh, in front. Okay, yeah, sure, sorry.
There were 2 as well.
Efforts to persuade the supermarkets and large outlets to exhibit their healthy foods more prominently, being successful. Is there any Or who should take the lead on it? It's not the responsibility, who should take the lead?
To summarise and correct me if I haven't quite got this, your question is, are there any examples of supermarkets leading by example of making healthier foods more prominent? And if everybody's doing this, whose responsibility is it to redesign supermarkets? I don't know is one answer. I'm aware of, well, a few years ago in this country, in 2010, with the coalition government, we had what was called the responsibility deal, which was a voluntary agreement between governments and food and drink manufacturers and retailers to label and redesign their products for healthier populations. And I was on one of the networks for that, and I recall that one supermarket did remove from the entrance area all the beers and wines that you often see. And they thought the other supermarkets were going to follow suit. They didn't. And what they found was their sales went down. Guess what happened? They reintroduced them. And it's been observed that you need to have a level playing field, particularly if sales are going to go down. So I mentioned the consultation that's open at the moment on marketing of products in store, which is looking at where in store products are placed, as well as buy one, get one free products. And there is an assessment by government of what the impact of that would be, and part of the assessment is a loss to the supermarkets and the manufacturers. The gain is to the NHS in terms of health. So, whose responsibility is it? Well, the supermarkets are not designed, I mean, that's not the business model to promote health. So, I'm not sure that it's anybody's responsibility other than that of the state that has a responsibility towards the health of the people. I think we have a responsibility as citizens to write to our MPs and, if possible, to access the consultation document that's out at the moment and see whether or not one is able to respond to that.
Just very briefly, some analogies in other sectors. We used to sell engines and we sell aircraft hours because we're interested in how getting from A to B. In the healthcare sector, 30% of medicines are never consumed. Yet we have an NHS that can't afford some the health budgets are really challenged. And I think this sort of outcome-based contracting, which has taken place in other areas, involved a number of different stakeholders, insurance companies, service providers. So maybe there's some learnings from other sectors on how others could be involved. But I agree with Theresa that there's it's not a single organisation, it's got to be a group of organisations coming together.
Okay. Can I just add in one thing, which is back to your question? There is a view that the British population was at its healthiest during rationing during the Second World War. So you can actually regulate these things, but there are other circumstances which follow.
We won't follow that application. We have a question.
Yes, it actually kind of relates to that last comment. I found very interesting all the comments about the research that's done into packaging, presentation, positioning in supermarkets. But there is another P which hasn't been mentioned, and that's preparation. And I'm wondering if there's any study being done of the extent to which the perceived relative time consumption or difficulty of preparing certain kinds of food is actually preventing people from making those choices. I mean, if you think of a strange paradox, I believe that pot noodles are extremely popular, and yet an awful lot of people watch MasterChef on television. And it's a very strange world we live in. Comments?
That's me, is it? Okay. And I think when Theresa put up the first slide, and it's very interesting if you look across Europe around the different food cultures. And if one looks, I have a number of Portuguese friends and colleagues these days, in the Portuguese society, that you would prepare food that would actually take it seriously is a key part of your identity in certain respects. It's part of what you do, it's part of being that person in that culture. And so I think if you look at how things are across Europe and how things have changed in a country like the UK or the US over time, I think one sees a cultural drift so that the identity becomes part of the story of why you might do something. And if actually preparing food at home, sharing it around the family meal table, that's a key part of your identity, that can lead you to these good habits in a way that a series of individual decisions alone work.
Okay, move briefly down the line.
I would just like to echo Dave's comments that I think that this is about culture and the culture shift that it is across Europe. And I was a member of the school food plan group that, again, actually, the coalition government. And the coalition government was unusual in many ways. One of the ways which was unusual from senior civil servants is evidence had a very high premium because that's how many decisions were fought and won on base evidence in a way that they often aren't in more ordinary times. So the school food plan, with which had 2 celebrity chefs, always got to have a celebrity chef. So this was Henry Dimbleby and John Vincent. And this was about for primary schools. And the focus of it was on food as a social and cultural experience. And it's not about teaching how to cook, but recognising in many of the primary schools in this country, there are children from many different cultures, and bringing the parents and the grandparents into the school every so often to cook from those different cultures, children sitting down, sharing food, a very important part of the experience. I don't know how we go back to a time that we've talked about. Cookery lessons, I don't think that cuts it. Watching it on TV, I don't think that cuts it.
Okay. Jack, do you want a final comment?
Very briefly, interestingly, your example of pot noodles. So in the demographics of a town with a high student population, pot noodle came out as the most frequently bought SKU out of the 1,300 we looked at. So demographics matters. I can't tell you which flavour it was.
Not your favourite.
Okay, so just by way of a quick survey, so we'd like a quick survey, I'm sure you'd like to just shuffle around a bit and just introduce that, because I'm sure as consumers you actually all want to get out of here. Can I just ask how many of you, as a result of this evening's discussion, will change your behaviour when you go next to the supermarket? So first of all, for those of you visiting the supermarket, how many think now, with the insights you've had tonight, you might change your behaviour in terms of selecting buy one get one free or whatever? No, hardly anything. Yeah, well, come on, don't be shy. Come on. No. Okay, there's a very scary. So what about shopping online? How many of you shopping online are going to look very closely at other people bought or other people were interested in when you now shop online as a result of what you've heard tonight? You seem to be very...
Can I say there are people have paid attention and they know that information doesn't change their behaviour. So it's 100%.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can you join me in thanking tonight's panel and tonight's organisers?